The High Matriarch did not move as the vibroblade hissed toward her throat, the air ionizing around the edge of the steel. Then, a blur of charcoal gray will shoved her back. Kalen Voss stepped into the gap, his shoulder catching the strike meant for a goddess, his blood hot and sudden against her silver robes. Would you risk everything for a stranger who considers you a ghost? Subscribe to walk the halls of the Nexus with us and witness the moment Immortal changed the fate of an empire. Let's go back to where the silence first broke. The scent of sterile filtration had been the only thing filling Kalen's lungs 6 hours earlier, back when his biggest concern was a malfunctioning floor buffer near the east gate. High Matriarch Alara moved through the Ethelgard Nexus like a moon pulling the tide. Behind her, the silver sovereignty trailed in a wake of shimmering silk and silent, predatory grace. To the sovereignty, a human life is a flickering candle. To Alara, however, the man standing at post Gamma 9 was a son she hadn't seen in 4 centuries. Kalen Voss stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands clasped behind his back in a standard rest position. He was a ghost in a gray uniform, a face from a dead century standing guard in a crowded hall. Alara stopped. Her advisors drifted to a halt, their confusion radiating like heat, but she could only track the line of the guard's jaw. It was the exact geometry of Prince Valerius, her husband, dead since the Great Collapse. Kalen didn't look at her directly. It was against protocol. But he offered a small, respectful nod of the head, a private signal he gave to everyone from ambassadors to the janitorial staff. Alara felt a phantom ache in her chest, a sensation she had buried under layers of statecraft and immortality. By the second day of the summit, the matriarch's deviations were the talk of the station. She began walking past Gamma 9 3 times a cycle. She watched him through the security feeds she'd surreptitiously pulled to her private quarters. She saw him help an elderly Draxian find a lost cooling vent. She saw him share his ration bar with a stray drone cat. He was a man of quiet heroism, the kind who did the right thing without seeking an audience. She had read his file. He had refused 3 promotions to stay on the front lines of the Nexus. He was 42 years old, a mere heartbeat in her timeline, yet he carried a weight in his eyes that spoke of a deep understanding of duty. She found herself wondering if his skin was as warm as it looked, or if he, too, was made of the cold duty that defined her own existence. The third day brought a shift in the atmosphere. The hum of the station felt jagged, the frequency of the power grid flickering just enough to make the hair on Kalen's arms stand up. He adjusted his belt, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's focus that looked jarringly out of place on such a gentle face. The summit was reaching its crescendo, the treaties ready for the final seal. Alara was scheduled to speak at the Great Altar. As she approached, she caught Kalen's eye for the first time. He didn't look away. In that gaze, she saw no awe, only a steady, human recognition of another soul burdened by a crown. Are you enjoying the tension of the Nexus? Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss how this cosmic connection survives the coming storm. Then the world turned inside out. The explosion didn't sound like a bang. It sounded like the universe tearing a seam. The Great Altar erupted in a fountain of white fire and jagged polycarbon. Alara was thrown back, the shockwaves stripping away her kinetic shields. Smoke, thick and smelling of burnt circuits, flooded the corridor. She tried to stand, but her equilibrium was gone. Through the haze, she saw them, 2 figures in matte black tactical gear, their faces hidden by void masks. They didn't want the altar. They wanted the matriarch. They moved with the synchronized lethality of professional assassins, closing the distance while the rest of the Sovereignty's guard was pinned down 3 levels below. Alara reached for her internal energy reserves, but the dampening field from the blast had left her hollow. She was a queen of 1,000 years, reduced to a trembling woman on a debris-strewn floor. The lead assassin raised a humming vibroblade, the weapon glowing with a sickly violet light. The violet blade hummed, a predatory snarl in the sudden ruin of the hall. Alara watched it descend, her breath hitching in a throat that had forgotten how to scream. Then came the gray blur. Not a god, not an immortal, just a man in a scorched uniform who threw himself into the path of the killing blow. Kalen didn't hesitate. He didn't have the luxury of 1,000 years to weigh the cost. As the blade bit into his shoulder, his face contorted, but his hands, those steady, mortal hands, clamped around the assassin's wrist. He used his own momentum to drive the killer into the jagged remains of a marble pillar. The sound of the impact was sickeningly dull. The second assassin pivoted, a kinetic pistol leveling toward Alara's chest. Kalen didn't wait to bleed out. He lunged from a crouch, his good arm sweeping a heavy decorative urn from its pedestal. It caught the shooter in the temple just as the muzzle flashed, the bolt high-veering into the ceiling. Kalen was on him a second later, a whirlwind of desperate, practiced violence. He used his weight, his elbows, and the raw, terrifying urgency of a creature that knows its time is short. When the silence finally returned, it was heavier than the explosion. Kalen stood over the slumped forms, his chest heaving. His gray sleeve was soaked a dark, terrifying crimson. He didn't look at the carnage. He turned to Alara, his knees buckling slightly before he caught himself. "High Matriarch," he rasped, his voice scraping against the smoke. He didn't ask if she was unharmed. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face for the slightest tremor. He reached out, his fingers stopping just short of her silver robes, hesitant to stain her with his reality. "Are you whole?" It was the same selfless focus she had seen in the archives, the same look Valerius had given her before the sky fell 4 centuries ago. But this wasn't an echo. This was a man dying in the present tense for a woman he barely knew. The medbay smelled of ozone and synthetic skin graft. Alara sat by the hovering cot, her regal stature feeling like a leaden weight. Kalen looked smaller under the harsh white lights, his shoulder knit together by humming blue lasers. He looked at her, and for the first time the protocol was gone. "You should be with the council," he said softly. "The council is a circle of ghosts," Alara replied, her voice trembling. "I have spent 400 years surrounded by things that last forever, Kalen. I had forgotten the light of a candle." She reached out, her cool hand finally covering his warm, calloused one. He didn't pull away. He knew, as she did, the math of their lives. She would live to see empires crumble. He would be lucky to see the next century. "I am a ghost to you," he whispered, echoing her own thoughts. "A face from a dead century." "No," she said, leaning closer until the charged space between them vanished. "You are the only thing in this nexus that feels real. They offer me 1,000 years of politics. You offered me 60 seconds of truth." A week later, as the Sovereignty spires prepared to break atmosphere, Alara stood on the observation deck. Kalen approached, now dressed in a crisp black tunic of the Royal Guard, a position created just for him. He stood at her side, not behind her. He didn't speak. He simply offered that same small, respectful nod of the head, a private signal that now carried the weight of a life pledged. The stars outside were cold and eternal, but as Alara looked at the man beside her, she chose the heat of the moment over the chill of the centuries. The gray uniform was gone, replaced by silk, but the man remained. On the console lay his old security badge, its plastic casing cracked from the blast, a relic of a life he had nearly surrendered. Alara touched the scarred plastic, then looked up at him, her heart tightening in a way she finally understood. She wasn't afraid of the end anymore. She was only afraid of missing the middle. The badge sits in a velvet case now, a reminder that the most durable things aren't made of stone. If you had only a few decades left, who would you stand in front of a blade for? Subscribe to join our next Chronicle of the Stars, where we explore the cost of a heartbeat. See you tomorrow.